The paddle of your canoe slips into the black water of the Pocomoke River with hardly a sound at all. Night gathers differently here. It's thicker and lower and closer to the skin. The cypress trees lean close over the banks, their roots twisting down into water so dark it barely reflects the moon. Somewhere deeper in the marsh, something splashes once, then goes quiet again. The Pocomoke sits between the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean, and there are parts of this river so deep, so stained black by the tannins of cypress knees, that a few feet beneath the surface, the light disappears completely. People around here will tell you it's best not to think too hard about what might still be moving beneath it, especially at night, especially alone. Your canoe drifts forward through the fog. The water laps softly against the sides like breathing. Somewhere off in the distance, a heron calls out, a sharp, almost human sound. For just a moment, you could swear someone answered it. Not loudly or clearly, but just enough to make the hair rise along your arms. They say this river keeps ghosts. Phantom boats slipping silently through the mist, bells ringing where churches no longer stand, figures seen walking the banks years after they drowned, screams carried over the water long after midnight, and every now and then, someone swears they saw a woman. She's not standing on the riverbank, not standing on a boat. No, she is something pale, moving beneath the bleak surface beside them. A face just glimpsed beneath the waterline. Long dark hair spreading through the river like ink. Eyes reflecting moonlight from impossible depths. Maybe it was only exhaustion. Maybe fog and darkness playing tricks on the mind. Maybe one of the ancient sturgeon that still haunt these waters, enormous and armored, rising from the deeper channels like something the river forgot to finish burying. Or maybe humans have always sensed something watching from the water, and have spent thousands of years trying to give it a shape they could understand. These are some of the waters that raised me. Suspended between river and sea, fresh water and salt, land and tide, liminal places, threshold places. These are the sort of places humans have always filled with ghosts and gods, and women with impossible eyes. I want to talk about the women the world keeps placing into places like this. The drowned and the divine. The singing and the screaming. The women who heal and haunt and refuse to stay where they were put. There are stories in nearly every corner of the world about women in water. Women who lure sailors into the deep. Women who guard rivers like thresholds. Women who bless and mourn and transform and drag entire ships beneath the waves. Women who wait beneath the surface, watching humanity from older and stranger depths. And perhaps that's because water itself has always felt a little alive, like it's listening, like it's a little unwilling to belong entirely to us. Now, when most people hear the words mermaid or siren, they tend to picture something fairly simple. A beautiful woman in the water. Maybe she's dangerous. Maybe she's seductive. Maybe she's part of a tragic story. She's the sort of creature painted on the side of old ships or printed on tourist shop postcards. But the deeper you go into these stories, the stranger they become. This is not really an episode about mermaids. Well, at least not entirely. This is an episode about power and longing. It's about transformation and grief and fear and beauty and autonomy. This is about the ways humans try to explain the parts of the world that refuse to stay tame. And water has always been one of those things. Water is life giver. It nourishes crops. It carries people across oceans. There are entire civilizations that rise beside it. But water also drowns. Water floods and erases borders. Water swallows cities. It changes shape constantly. Water refuses containment. So perhaps it makes sense that cultures across the world keep imagining something living within it. And very often, that something becomes a woman. Throughout this episode, we're going to be speaking a great deal about femininity and feminine coded spirits because many cultures historically mapped water, emotion, transformation, and beauty and danger and seduction and mystery and creation onto women specifically. But mythology tells us far more about the societies creating these stories than it does about any universal gender-coded truth. When a culture fears women who wander, it tells stories about women who lure men to their deaths. When it reveres women as keepers of life, prophecy, healing, or sacred knowledge, it tells stories about mothers of oceans and rivers. And between those two shores, there is an entire sea of stranger possibilities. And that is where I want us to linger. Not with one simple answer or one universal symbol or one tidy little moral we can pin down and preserve like a specimen under glass, but with the shifting pattern itself. The way these stories change shape depending on who is telling them. The way a singing bird woman becomes a mermaid. The way a river guardian becomes a warning. The way a sacred being becomes a superstition, then a painting, then a fantasy, then a Halloween costume, and then maybe, if we are listening carefully enough, something sacred again. Because again and again, across continents and centuries, humans have looked into dark water and imagined something looking back. Something beautiful enough to desire, yet strange enough to fear. Old enough to worship and wounded enough to haunt us. These symbols are fluid, porous, and ever-changing, much like those waters they rise from. And perhaps that's fitting. Water resists simplification, too. Before we get to the women themselves, I think we have to pause for a moment at the edge of the water. Because the shoreline has never been an ordinary place. It is not quite land, not quite sea. It is the place where the solid world gives way beneath us, where the roots lessen and the roads end. It's where the civilized, mapped, named world meets something older, wider, and much less interested in our little human arrangements. The shoreline is a threshold, and humans have always known thresholds are dangerous. The places and times where one thing becomes another and the rules begin to blur. We all recognize doorways and crossroads, riverbanks and graveyards, midnight and dawn, the moment just before a storm breaks, the moment just after a body stops breathing. And we always fill these spaces with spirits, something waiting there just beyond the place where certainty ends. The sea has always been one of our greatest thresholds. It divides nations and connects them. It takes people away from home and sometimes brings them back changed, if it brings them back at all. It carries tide, migration, conquest, exile, escape. prayer, bodies, memory. It is a road and a graveyard, womb and mouth, mirror and monster. It's no wonder sailors became some of the most superstitious people on Earth. They lived for months at a time in the in-between, suspended between sky and depth, between homeland and horizon, between the living who waited for them and the dead who disappeared without burial. A ship is a threshold too, really. A little wooden world carried across something no human can command. And then there are the people who live beside the water. The fishermen and lighthouse keepers. Widows watching harbors and children raised near marshes. Families who know exactly what the tide sounds like when it's turning. People who understand that water is beautiful, yes, but never tame, and never harmless, and never fully ours. Sometimes the most haunted thresholds are the people who live beside them. Ports and harbors have always felt a little enchanted to me for this reason. They're places of arrival and departure, of strangers and sailors, of goods and gossip, of lovers waiting at windows and ships slipping out before dawn. They are places where language mix, where stories change hands, where gods travel under new names. And islands, too. Islands feel like they belong halfway to another world. Caves along the coast, fog rolling in so thick the familiar shore vanishes. Drowned villages, lost cities, bells beneath the sea. Places where the map goes pale and the ink seems to run out. Thresholds are where rules blur. It makes sense that we pour our fears and desires into the beings who live there. And if the water is a threshold, then the beings within it are never just monsters. They are messengers from the edge of order. They are warnings and invitations, reflections. They are what we imagine waiting for us when we step too far beyond that world we know. So before a mermaid is ever a woman with a fishtail, before a siren is ever a pretty face with a dangerous song, before a Selkie is ever a wife with a hidden skin, she is something older than all of that. She is the shape we give to the feeling that the water is watching, that something lives where we cannot breathe, that something knows what we become when we cross over. And if the edge of the sea is a threshold, then the first thing we hear from it is a voice. And in so many of the oldest stories, that voice belongs to a siren. Not the mermaid you're probably picturing. Not a woman with a fishtail perched on a rock, hair blowing glamorously in the wind, waiting to ruin some sailor's otherwise perfectly productive afternoon. In the oldest Greek tales, sirens were bird women. They had women's faces and bodies, but the wings and talons of birds. And they sat on rocky islands surrounded by the wreckage of ships. They were less swimsuit model and more grave marker, less romantic sea maiden and more death singer, calling from the edge of the known world. And their song wasn't just there to lure men in, it was also a promise. In Homer's Odyssey, when Odysseus approaches the island of the Sirens, he has already survived storms and monsters and gods with grudges. He has lost men. He has wandered far from home. He has become the kind of man who is always trying to return somewhere, even while making choices that keep dragging him farther away. He is warned about the sirens before he reaches them. He is told that no one hears their songs and survives it. Ships steer too close, Men forget themselves, and the rocks do the rest. But Odysseus does not choose silence. He chooses strategy. He melts beeswax and presses it into the ears of his sailors so that they cannot hear the song at all. Then he orders them to tie him upright to the mast and to keep rowing no matter what he says, no matter how he begs, no matter how badly he wants to be released. This is so revealing. He does not stay away from the danger. He wants to hear it. He wants the song. He wants the knowledge, but not the consequence. So the ship passes the island, and the sirens begin to sing. Different translations give them different words, but the shape of the temptation remains the same. They don't simply say, "Come closer, handsome sailor." They say essentially, "We know you. We know what you have suffered. We know everything that has happened and everything that will happen. Come closer. Hear it all. Be understood." The sirens do not tempt Odysseus with sex. They tempt him with meaning, with knowledge, with recognition, with the kind of song that says, "Your suffering matters and your story is known. There is something waiting here that can explain you to yourself." And that is far more dangerous than a pretty face on a rock. Of course, Odysseus goes wild. He strains against the ropes. He begs his men to turn the ship toward the sound. He orders them to untie him, but they cannot hear him. They can't hear the song. They just keep rowing, eyes fixed ahead, with their captain losing his mind at the center of the ship. He survives because he is bound, because he cheated the bargain, because he wants that knowledge without consequence. And the more I think about this scene, the less it feels like a story about lust, and the more it feels like a story about dangerous speech, about the kind of voice that reaches past your reason and touches whatever part of you is tired or lonely or proud or desperate to be understood. The siren has no sword, no army, no storm conjured out of thin air. She has sound, words and music, and the power to make a man forget the orders that were supposed to keep him alive. And we all know women whose voices alter behavior are frightening. A woman who stands in a public square and sways a crowd. A woman who sings and people stop working just to listen. A woman whose grief becomes contagious. A woman whose story makes the room go quiet. Cultures that are very invested in who gets to speak and who gets to listen often turn that woman into a monster or a warning. The siren song becomes speech that bypasses permission. You did not decide to want this. You heard it, and then you were already moving. And of course, these stories grow on ships. Imagine that world for a moment. Those long months at sea, no land in sight, no fresh faces to be seen, and certainly no privacy. The same boards beneath your feet, the same creak of rope and timber, the same horizon widening and refusing you day after day. A ship is a little wooden world carried across something that no human can command. And when you live inside that much uncertainty for long enough, every sound begins to matter. So sailors made rules about sound. Do not whistle on board, they said. You might whistle up a wind you cannot control. Do not sing into bad weather. Do not brag about safe passage. Do not say certain things by their true names. Do not speak too boldly of drowning. The sea listens, and she does not like arrogance. And absolutely do not bring a woman on a ship. The story was that a woman on board brought bad luck. that her very presence angered the ocean, that she made the waves jealous or called storms to the mast. But if you listen between the lines, you can hear something else. A woman on board meant desire in a place that demanded numbness. It meant softness in a place built on discipline. It meant memories of home in a world that required you to forget the shore long enough to survive the sea. It is better to say she anchors the sea than admit she unsettles you. And listen, you cannot convince me that sailors weren't just deeply superstitious theater kids, full of drama, inventing rituals and taboos and very serious rules about whistling because the weather had the audacity to be unpredictable. But underneath the jokes, these superstitions are doing something. Superstitions are always rooted in something more. Men's shouts, men's orders, men's songs, men's prayers, all of those are allowed. A woman's voice, though, dangerous. The siren sits at the center of that anxiety. She is what happens if you take all of those rules about sound and break them in one body. A woman whose voice travels over water, bypasses discipline, and calls men away from the work they owe to Captain, King, and God. In that sense, she is not just a monster. She is a union between the sea and the feminine voice, two forces the ship's hierarchy cannot fully control. Songs in these myths are rarely just songs. Instead, they become tests or traps or invitations to cross a boundary you cannot uncross. The siren song asks, what would you give up to know what you're really made of? What would you risk for one moment of feeling truly seen? What if the thing that finally understands you also destroys you? When we look at sirens this way, we can start to see them not as sexy sea monsters, but as story shapes for a very old anxiety. That certain voices can unravel the neat little structures we build around obedience and control. We see that pattern again and again. The singing woman, the pleading woman, the praying woman, the grieving woman, the woman whose sound changes things, the woman whose sound is called dangerous. But the voice that calls from the water is not always evil. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is longing. Sometimes it is memory. Sometimes it is the sound of a power you have been taught to fear, asking you to come closer anyway. The voice is the first thing we hear from the water, but it will not be the last. If sirens are the voice that calls you off your course, Selkies are the women who were never meant to be on your ship in the first place. Their stories belong to cold, rocky coast in Scotland and the Northern Isles, carried through oral tradition long before many of them were written down, with versions appearing in 19th century folklore collections and local accounts. They come from places where the sea is not decorative. Here, the sea is work and hunger, distance and death, livelihood and home. On clear days, you might see seals bobbing in the water like dark stones coming to life. They're watching and then vanishing, then returning. And on certain nights, the stories say, those seals come ashore, peel off their skins, and walk as human women and men on the sand. The most famous version goes something like this. A man is walking alone along the beach late at night, late enough that decent people are meant to be in bed and indecent things are meant to be happening elsewhere. The moon is bright. The tide is low. The rocks are slick and shining. The sea is breathing in that slow, ancient way it has. And then he sees them. A group of seals haul themselves out of the water and onto the rocks. For a moment, they are only animals, sleek and dark and wet with moonlight. Then, impossibly, they begin to shed their skins. And suddenly, there are people where there had been seals. Women laughing on the sand. Men shaking seawater from their hair. Bodies silvered by moonlight. Bare feet pressing into the tide-wet shore. They dance at the edge of the world, where the land has given up and the sea has not yet fully taken over. He should not be there. This is not a scene meant for human eyes, but he stays, hidden in the shadows watching. And in most versions of the tale, there is one Selkie woman who catches his attention. Maybe she laughs more softly than the others. Maybe she keeps glancing toward the water, even in her human shape, as if half of her is still listening beneath the waves. Maybe her sealskin lies closer to where he is hiding, as though the story itself has quietly opened a door and is waiting to see what kind of man he will become. You already know what he does next. He steals her skin. He waits until the others have finished their dance, until one by one they slip back into their seal selves and slide home into the water. And then he steps out from his hiding place and speaks to the woman who cannot find what he has stolen. Without it, she cannot go home. Without it, she cannot become herself. He offers her the safety of a home, food and shelter and clothing, the trappings of domestic life. He promises to be kind. In some versions, he even tells her he loves her right there on the empty beach, as if love could soften the shape of what he has already done. And because stories about power often come disguised as romances, she goes with him. The years pass. She becomes his wife and bears his children. She tends his fire. She learns the names of neighbors and friends and family. She walks the cliffs with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders while the sea wind tries to find a way beneath it. From the outside, perhaps it looks like a life, a respectable life even. But the old stories almost always make a point of telling us that she never stops looking back towards the water. She lingers at the shoreline too long. She pauses when the seals cry offshore. Her children find her standing ankle-deep in the surf, skirt soaked through, staring at the horizon with the expression of someone hearing her own name spoken from very far away. Because the skin is still there, of course, hidden, sometimes in a chest at the foot of the bed, sometimes under a loose floorboard, sometimes tucked high in the rafters where she is never meant to look. The house becomes a kind of spell around the missing thing, a whole life built around absence. And the man tells himself he has done nothing wrong. He's given her shelter and children and taken care of her. He brought her in from the cold and the wind and the unforgiving sea. In his mind, the sea is the villain. The land is the reward. He is the hero. The story does not agree, because one day, after 7 years or 10 or 20, the hidden thing is found. Maybe the children are playing while the father is away and discover something folded in a place no one ever goes. Maybe they carry it to their mother, innocent and curious, not knowing they have just placed a door back into her hands. "Mama," they ask, "what is this?" And something in her changes. In some versions, she says nothing. She only presses the skin to her chest and runs. In others, she gathers her children into her arms first. She kisses their hair. She tells them she loves them. She promises, perhaps, to watch over them from the water. Sometimes she takes one child with her. Sometimes she cannot. Sometimes the cruelty of the story is that every possible choice breaks something. But the ending is almost always the same. By the time the husband returns, there is an empty house, frightened children, and a dark shape moving beyond the breakers. A seal lifts its head once above the water and looks back towards the shore. Then it is gone. And in some tellings, the children will later see one seal swimming close to the rocks when no other seals are near. One seal who watches a little longer than the rest. The woman is loved only when she is trapped. That is the heart of the Selkie story. The man calls it love, but it is love that depends on her not having a choice. Love that depends on a stolen skin hidden in a box. Love that cannot survive the moment she has the means to leave. Captivity and love are incompatible. The sealskin in these stories is not just a costume. It is her selfhood and her language. It is her family. It is her entire world. Taking it is not borrowing a coat. It is taking someone's passport, their name, their memories, and their right to fully and freely move through the world. Some forms of freedom cost love, and some forms of love are captivity. This is what makes Selkie tales so haunting. They are not about a woman torn between two equal worlds, one on land and one in sea. They are about a woman who never had a real choice to begin with. Of course she goes back. Of course she returns to the water, even if it breaks her heart, even if she cannot take all of her children with her, even if she spends the rest of her life surfacing near the cliffs to stare at a house she once lived in. These stories understand something about the pain of belonging nowhere fully. Too human for the sea, too seal for the land, too wild for the village, too bound for the open water. Anyone who has ever felt like they left a truer self hanging somewhere in the dark, waiting to be found, already knows this story. You can call the skin whatever you need it to be. The career you never got to have, the love you weren't allowed to choose, the gender or sexuality you were told to hide, the art you stopped making because it didn't fit into your life. Something that smells like your real name, folded away in a box you are not supposed to open. Selkie tales give that feeling a body. They say you can build an entire life around that missing thing. You can be kind and dutiful and even beloved, but you will never stop hearing the sound of the waves against the door. In these stories, the sea carries danger, yes, but also home, freedom, memory, and return. It is the place where she is no longer somebody's wife or somebody's mother or somebody's pretty mystery on the shore, but herself. The human husband thinks that sea is the rival, but the real rival is her own autonomy. The Selkie does not leave because the ocean seduces her. She leaves because the ocean is the only place where no one else owns her skin. The untethered woman becomes mythic. We tell these stories over and over because they hold a shape for something we do not always have language for. That feeling that your life looks fine from the outside, but somewhere beneath the floorboards, something essential is waiting. Somewhere you can still hear the tide calling to the part of you that remembers another element. So let's leave her there for a moment. A woman standing in a doorway, sealskin in her arms, listening to the tide. Her children sleeping by the fire. Her husband walking home along the cliff path, believing everything will always be the way he left it. The sea breathing in and out beyond the threshold. There is grief in every choice she has. There is grief in every choice she does not. And somewhere beneath all of it, there is the steady sound of waves against stone, promising that there is a life for her beyond this house, beyond this story, and beyond this version of herself. That heartbeat of water is going to follow us into the next section, where the woman in the water is not a seal bride escaping, but a body that never comes home. If Selkie stories are about women who are taken from the water, Victorian stories are very often about women who never make it out. There is one image especially that seems to haunt the 19th century. A young woman floating on her back in a river, skirts spread around her like a halo, hands open, face turned toward the sky as if she has fallen asleep in the water instead of drowned in it. Her name is Ophelia. If you haven't met her yet, she's a character in Shakespeare's Hamlet, a young noblewoman caught between a father who uses her for politics, a prince who uses her for his own drama, and a court that treats her as an ornament until she fractures. By the time she wanders down to the stream with an armful of flowers, talking to herself and singing broken snatches of song, her mind has already come undone. We never see her die on stage. The queen comes in later and describes it for us instead. Ophelia climbing a willow tree, garlands catching on a branch, a fall into the brook, her clothes ballooning around her and keeping her afloat, mermaid-like, for a moment while she sings and sings until the wet fabric drags her under. Centuries later, Victorian artists become obsessed with that moment. And to be fair, the Victorians were already very committed to suffering as an aesthetic. This is the era of mourning jewelry, death portraits, consumptive heroines, spiritualism, Gothic revival, and people turning grief into entire decorative programs. They inherited Romanticism's love of beautiful ruin and added their own intense fascination with morality, death, purity, madness, and fallen women. So Ophelia was perfect for them. Painters like John Everett Millais turned her death into one of the most iconic images of the era. She lies in a green English river, surrounded by painstakingly painted wildflowers, face serene, lips parted, palms open in a gesture halfway between surrender and prayer. The water holds her gently. There is no bloating, no discoloration, no violence. She is tragedy, but she is also decor. The drowned woman becomes a floating contradiction, powerless, but still charged with threat. She is safe because she is dead. She will no longer talk back. She will no longer refuse anyone. But something about her refuses to let your gaze go. She pulls you in. She lingers. Victorian culture aestheticized female suffering until grief itself became decorative. Painters didn't just depict Ophelia. They painted countless other fallen women slipping into rivers, women who had been seduced and abandoned, women who had broken the rules of class or sexuality or obedience and were now conveniently beautiful corpses. The water becomes a kind of moral bleach. It washes away their agency and leaves only innocence and pity. It matters that in painting after painting, she is pale, delicate, alone in a river framed by lush greenery and soft light. When we talk about the Victorian obsession with drowned women, it's worth noticing whose body is being romanticized. Because at the very same historical moment, and to this day, the Atlantic itself is an unmarked graveyard. So while Ophelia is being painted over and over in comfortable English parlors, millions of kidnapped Africans, including women and girls, have already died on slave ships or been thrown overboard during the Middle Passage. Their bodies vanished into the sea as lost cargo. No artist stood on the shore to record the exact turn of their hands as they went under. No wildflowers were catalogued beside them. No lush green banks were painted around their last breath. There are black divers, historians, and artists today who work directly with those wrecks and those memories, treating the ocean as an ancestral burial ground rather than a backdrop. Their work is where the deeper reckoning belongs. Here, I just don't want this section to sit in a little bubble of pretty sorrow, as if the only women the water holds are white and softly lit. If this is a thread you want to follow further, I'd encourage you to spend time with Black scholarship and Black artistic work that thinks deeply with the Atlantic and its histories, including books like Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother or Christina Sharp's In the Wake, alongside the work of Black maritime archaeologists diving on slave shipwrecks. Their work carries knowledge, memory, and forms of attention that deserve to be engaged with directly and not filtered through me. I'll put a few starting points in the show notes so this conversation doesn't end here. So when we look at Ophelia and her sisters, we are really looking at a very narrow fantasy of loss. A white woman's body, purified by water, and turned into safe spectacle. The danger isn't just in the paintings. It's what they teach us to find beautiful. A woman is most worthy of contemplation when she is quiet, passive, helpless, when her pain is arranged just so, when her suffering doesn't ask anything of us except to feel moved. You can still feel this echo in the way that we talk about tragic women now. Just think about the soft aesthetic of sad girls in bathtubs, the romanticizing of breakdowns on social media, the way certain kinds of self-destruction gets framed as ethereal or haunting. Just think about how fascinated we are with beautifully broken women in films and series and social media, women whose trauma is curated, whose mess becomes mood lighting. And it shows up in spiritual spaces, too. Sometimes it's wearing a flower crown and calling itself liberation. There is a difference between vulnerability and performance. There is a difference between telling the truth about pain and turning your collapse into a brand. There is a difference between being brave enough to be seen and demanding that everyone watch while you set yourself and sometimes everyone around you on fire. Because not every public unraveling is freedom. Sometimes it is just another version of Ophelia in the water, arranged beautifully enough that no one asked who pushed her there, who benefits from the spectacle, or what it would actually take for her to climb out. It is Ophelia over and over again, just with better eyeliner and a ring light. And so the problem here isn't that we are moved by suffering. Of course we are moved by suffering. We should be. The problem is when we learn to find suffering more compelling than survival. When the breakdown gets softer lighting than the boundary. When the spiral gets applause and the quiet work of healing is treated like it has no poetry in it. And just as importantly, whose suffering gets framed as poetic in the first place. Because some pain is aestheticized, while other pain is ignored, criminalized, or treated as ordinary background noise. The Victorian drowned woman becomes unforgettable precisely because she is presented as delicate, mournable, worthy of lingering attention. Meanwhile, entire histories of Black and brown suffering disappear into statistics, archives, and oceans without ever being granted the same cultural tenderness. The Victorian drowned woman is a mirror for that impulse. She lets viewers feel a rush of emotion without confronting the structures that made her desperate. The painting ends the story at the waterline and calls it inevitable. But not every culture imagined the woman in the water as a warning or as a tragic ornament. Some saw her as a queen. Some saw as a healer. Some as a mother of rivers and oceans and storms. And that's where we're going next, away from the quiet English stream where Ophelia floats and into sovereign waters where the woman in the waves is not a victim of the river. She is the river itself. Up to now, the woman in the water has mostly been someone the story warns you about or mourns. She is a warning sign. That tragic ornament. A problem the story has already decided how to solve. But in many parts of the world, the feminine presence in water is not a problem to be solved. She is an authority. I do want to move carefully here because these are living traditions, not aesthetic ingredients. I'm not standing at the center of them. I'm standing at the shore, looking toward them with respect, and pointing you toward the people who know these waters from the inside. Let's begin on the coast and rivers of West and Central Africa and in the African diaspora with Mami Wata, Mother Water. She's often shown as a beautiful woman with a serpent or with a fishtail, surrounded by symbols of wealth and allure. Mirrors, combs, jewelry, sometimes modern objects like banknotes or a bottle of an imported drink. In some images, she looks almost like a European fantasy mermaid. In others, she's unmistakably something else, a queen in her own right, gaze direct and defiantly uninnocent. Mami Wata is not just pretty sea lady. She is a personification of water's seductions and dangers, but also of its capacity to bless. People come to her for many things, for healing and for protection, for luck in business and for fertility. They ask her for help crossing the waters of migration and survival, and in return, she may demand offerings, taboos, ritual changes in dress or behavior, or a deeper commitment to spiritual practice. She can bless you with wealth and healing, and also demand offerings, discipline, and change. Her danger isn't about moral panic over sex. It is the awe of standing too close to the tide. Stories about her often involve dreams of water, encounters that leave people mysteriously changed, or sudden reversals of fortune. She is seductive, but not in the simplistic sense of woman luring man to doom. She is seductive in the sense that power is seductive. especially power that offers a way out of impossible conditions. She is someone you negotiate with, and not someone you simply fear. If Mamiwata is the glamour and volatility of the water, Umoja, also known as Yumaya, in many Afro-diasporic traditions, is its mother. In Yoruba cosmology, Umoja is a major Orisha, a deity associated with rivers and with the source of all waters. In West Africa, she's especially linked to the Ogun River. Across the Atlantic, in places like Brazil, Cuba, and beyond, she becomes mother of the ocean itself. Star-crowned, skirt-like waves, hands full of shells, and children and foam. People call on her as protector of mothers and children, as comforter in grief, as patron of those who travel by sea. She is fierce when she needs to be, but her core image is maternal, the one who holds you when no one else can, and who also expects you to behave like you remember where you came from. Where a Victorian drowned woman is a symbol of fragility and collapse, Umoja is a symbol of resilience and continuity. The ocean is not what kills her. It is what she is made of. And across the diaspora, she has had to change. Torn from homelands by slavery, worshippers kept her alive under new names, in new rituals, syncretized with Catholic saints, braided into festivals and pilgrimages and ceremonies that had to survive under surveillance. Her very existence in the Americas is a quiet refusal to let the Middle Passage have the last word about who lives and who is remembered. The woman in the water here is not a warning. She is a home you can still return to, even when everything else has been taken. In Haitian voodoo and related traditions, La Sirène, literally the mermaid, is one of the Loa, the powerful spirits who serve as intermediaries between humans and the divine. She's often depicted with a fishtail, but also with a mirror and a comb, musical instruments, and an underwater palace of light. She's associated with beauty and song, with deep knowledge, with wealth and status, and with the uncanny sense that there is another world just beneath the surface of this one. When La Sirène appears in dreams or ritual, it's so much more than just a love story. It becomes a call to step into a deeper, more demanding relationship with the spirit world. She may grant favors, insight, artistic gifts, or social elevation, but just like Mamiwata, she is not a spirit to be treated transactionally. Her favors bind you into a relationship. There are obligations, offerings, days of service, and songs that must be sung correctly. There is a sense that she is watching how you carry the gifts she gave you. The key difference from many European dangerous mermaid tales is this: her sovereignty is taken for granted. She doesn't need to be explained away as an hallucination or punished as a temptress. She is part of a living pantheon with her own personality, preference, and worshippers. The woman in the water is not someone you project your fantasies onto. She is someone who has her own. If we widen out even further, we find many indigenous and Pacific traditions where water is more like a living relative, a being with whom you are in relationship. In Te Ao Maori, for example, water is deeply sacred. Rivers, springs, and seas are inhabited by atua, deities or powerful beings, and by Taniwha and other guardian entities. These are not generic water monsters, but specific presences tied to particular stretches of river, bays, lake mouths. They protect, warn, and sometimes punish. They're linked to genealogies, to stories of migration and origin, and to obligations of care. To insult the water is to insult your kin. Similarly, many indigenous peoples in North America speak of water as alive, sacred, and holding spirit. We can see echoes of that in Water is Life movements, where women often stand at the front as water protectors. That leadership does not need to accidentally rest on a flattened idea that women are naturally nurturing. It comes from long, specific histories of relationship, responsibility, ceremony, survival, and the safeguarding of sources of life. In those frameworks, a water being, even a feminine one, moves through more than myth. She belongs to a living web of place, obligation, kinship, and care. The spirit is not just a woman in the water. She is a living part of it. Where water is understood as sacred relation, the spirit becomes ancestor, healer, or sovereign guardian. She is one node in a mesh of reciprocity. If you take, you must give back. If you cross, you must show respect. If you ignore her warnings, the consequences are on you. So, at this point, you can hear the contrast. Some cultures imagine the water woman as a warning. Others imagined her as a force deserving reverence. Those are two very different ways of understanding power. In one system, female power outside narrow social roles is terrifying. It must be punished, pitied, or turned into a pretty corpse. In another, female-coded water power is divine, relational, and negotiated with. You might still be afraid of it, but you're also grateful for it. You don't confuse fear with moral condemnation. And then, as always, history happens. Colonialism and Christianization move through these water cosmologies like storms. Missionaries and colonizers seeing Mamawata or Yamoja or La Sirene or local river spirits often labeled them as devils, idols, superstition, or tellingly, mermaids in a way that strips context and authority. In some places, people are punished for keeping shrines at rivers, or for making offerings, or for singing the old songs. In others, the spirits are tolerated only if they're reinterpreted as saints, fairy tales, or harmless folklore. Later Victorian and European Romantic art take whatever images filter through. Exotic postcards, travelogues, misinterpreted carvings, and fold them into the growing global mermaid aesthetic. A syncretic, deeply local, spiritually complex being becomes a decorative sea lady on a print or a bar sign. So colonialism flattened entire cosmologies into pretty fish ladies. Modern pop culture often presents as ancient what is actually a much newer blend of older stories, moral anxieties, and visual conventions. And even within Europe, there were older, stranger, more ambivalent water spirits before the sermon and the souvenir shop got a hold of them. The contrast here is not as simple as Europe bad, everyone else pure. Nothing human is ever that tidy. Patriarchy, moral panic, and fear of feminine power appear in many places. What changes is the cosmology beneath them. So if your worldview already sees water as a living relative, a bearer of law and story, you are more likely to read a powerful water woman as ancestor or guardian. If your worldview sees nature as raw material and female bodies as property, you are more likely to turn her into a danger or a prize. The water remembers these choices. We have met the sea women now, the singers on the rocks, the seal brides with stolen skins, the drowned girls turned into art, the mothers of oceans and rivers, the queens, the guardians, the ghost, and the ones who bless with one hand and drag you under with the other. So before we go any further, I want to step back from their individual faces and look at the thing they all rise from, the water itself. Because water is never only scenery in these stories. It is never just the pretty blue backdrop behind the monster, or the convenient place to drown a tragic woman, or that sparkling little stage where a mermaid combs her hair and ruins a sailor's day. Water is doing something in these myths. It is carrying meaning. It is holding memory. It is behaving almost like a character of its own. And of course it is, because water has always been one of the great mysteries human beings live beside and inside and because of. On the most literal level, water is life. We come from it. We are carried in it before birth. Our bodies hold it. Our crops depend on it. Our cities rise beside it. Rivers decide where roads are built and where markets gather and where people settle down long enough to become a people. Rain decides whether a field becomes a harvest or a hunger. Coastlines decide what can arrive and what must remain far away. Ships carry goods and stories and languages and gods and diseases and families and armies and prayers across it. And long before anyone was writing psychology papers or publishing studies about blue space, humans already knew water did something to us. Ancient creation stories begin in primordial waters. Gods separate the deep from the dry. Islands rise out of the endless sea. Floods destroy old worlds so new ones can begin. Religious traditions across the globe return to water for washing, blessing, baptism, immersion, purification, initiation. Again and again, water becomes the substance we reach for when we need to cross from one state of being into another. Water connects worlds that would otherwise remain strangers to one another. But that same water that gives life also takes it back. It floods houses. It drowns fields. It swallows ships. It moves borders as if they were nothing but lines scratched into wet sand. Rivers change course. Coastlines vanish. Whole towns sink beneath reservoirs and bays, leaving roads and foundations and church steps somewhere below the surface, waiting in the dark like the bones of another life. Water moves without asking who owns the land it crosses. And that, I think, is part of why it unsettles us so much. Water does not respect our categories. It does not care very much about our fences, our maps, our property lines, our little declarations of permanence. It seeps where it can. It rises when it must. It wears down stone by returning again and again with a patience that feels almost holy until it is your house at the edge of the cliff. Water gives life, but also erases boundaries. It washes away blood and footprints and the sharp edges of things. It blurs the line between before and after, between what happened and what can still be proven, between what was lost and what may one day return. It swallows secrets, it hides bodies, it keeps its own counsel about what it is holding. So it makes sense that when humans try to talk about the unseen parts of life, we keep reaching for water. Depth psychologists noticed this too. Carl Jung famously wrote about water as one of the most common symbols of the unconscious, that deep shifting territory beneath the tidy story we tell about ourselves, where dream, instinct, memory, fear, desire, and shadow move in shapes we do not always recognize until they rise. In that kind of symbolic language, a still lake becomes emotional clarity. A stormy sea becomes turmoil. Floodwater becomes feeling that has overrun its banks. And diving becomes the work of going down into what we would rather not look at directly. The ocean's dark places mirror the dark places in us, not because they are evil, but because they are hidden, immense, and older than the little lamps we carry. We dream of tidal waves when our lives are changing faster than our minds can name. We talk about drowning in grief, being in over our heads, getting pulled into the undertow of a relationship, learning to swim in circumstances we did not choose. We speak this way almost without thinking, because somewhere beneath the language we know, the inner life behaves like water more often than we want to admit. It rises quietly until the room is full. It finds the cracks we thought were sealed. It carries things we believed were gone. The sea remembers. The sea returns things. The sea swallows names. Think of shipwrecks resting below the surface for centuries, of letters sealed in bottles and rings loosened from dead hands, bones washing up on shore long after the person who carried them was mourned or forgotten. Think of stories where the ocean gives a village back the body it took, or refuses to, leaving the living to build rituals around absence, because absence itself has become a kind of resident. Water becomes a kind of external memory. It keeps what we throw into it, whether that is pollutants or prayers, offerings or bodies, wedding rings or warships, and sometimes when we least expect it, it gives something back. And psychologically, that makes a terrible kind of sense. There are pieces of our own lives that sink out of sight. Old griefs, old fears, old versions of ourselves. Desires we don't know what to do with. Names we're not ready to answer to. Things we thought we had buried beneath enough years and errands and bills and morning coffee to make them stay gone. Then one dream, one song, one smell, one story drags them up from the depths, and suddenly they are at the surface again, startling and salt-streaked and still somehow ours. And then there's the body of it, because water does not only work on us symbolically, it works on us physically too. There's a growing body of research around what people now call blue spaces. Oceans, rivers, lakes, bays, fountains, even the sound of rain or waves when we cannot be near the real thing. And the science more or less confirms what most of us already feel in our bones. Being near water can lower stress, soften anxiety, invite awe, and create a kind of gentle attention where the mind can rest without going numb. That is part of why we stare at waves longer than we mean to, why rain sounds help people sleep, why a riverbank can make your problems feel, if not smaller, then at least less alone in the room with you. Moving water gives the mind something to follow that is larger than our own worry, but not asking anything from us except attention. Maybe that's why so many of us end up seeking it out without quite knowing why. Because our relationship with water has always been double. It calms us and frightens us. It holds us and takes from us. It gives the nervous system somewhere to soften, even while reminding the soul that nothing here is fully controllable. So, of course, cultures keep using water to think about transformation, unpredictability, relation, danger, and power. You cannot hold onto water the way you hold onto a stone. You cannot close your fist around it without losing it between your fingers. You can redirect it, dam it, poison it, pray for it, bottle it, bless it, and even build entire legal systems around who gets to use it. But you cannot fully command it. Given enough time, water finds the crack. It seeps through the wall. It wears down the cliff. It remembers another path. And again, societies took those qualities, the depth and fluidity, nourishment and danger, that ability to create and to destroy, the way water changes shape without ever stopping being itself, and gave them a human face, and very often a feminine one. That does not mean women are naturally chaotic or mysterious or somehow biologically closer to the tide, nor does it mean that ideas about femininity have ever been universal, fixed, or neatly divided from ideas about masculinity. Human experiences of gender have always been more varied than the symbolic systems built around them. That is much too simple and honestly a little boring. What it means is that cultures needed a body to carry everything that fascinated and frightened them about change. A society afraid of emotion might give it a woman's face and call her irrational. A society afraid of sexuality might give it a woman's body and say she lures men to their doom. A society in awe of birth and creation might look at the ocean and see a mother large enough to hold the world. A society that understands water as kin may give that water a name, a story, a spirit, and a set of responsibilities that bind the living to the source of life itself. These are symbolic systems, not biological truths. They tell us what a culture feared, what it worshipped, what it wanted to control, what it needed to protect, and what it secretly longed to surrender to. In some places, water and femininity became a warning label. In others, they became a title of reverence, mother of rivers, queen of the sea, she who brings the rains, she who holds the depths. And in all of them, whether feared or adored, mourned or worshipped, the combination carries power. So when we say mermaid or siren or selkie or river goddess, we are never only talking about creature design. We are talking about the feeling of standing at the edge of something larger than ourselves, an ocean, a grief, a desire, a history, and realizing it does not belong to us. Water spirits give that feeling a face. Sometimes we make it monstrous because we are afraid of what it wants from us. Sometimes we make it holy because we can feel that it is older than our fears. Sometimes we make it maternal because we need to believe something vast is capable of holding us. Sometimes we make it beautiful because beauty gives us a reason to keep looking at what terrifies us. And sometimes, if we are honest, we make it into the version of ourselves we are too frightened to become. Maybe that is why they keep returning. No matter how often we rationalize them, sanitize them, or romanticize them, or Disneyfy them, demonize them, or hang them in a bathroom next to a seashell soap dish, they keep slipping back into the story. Because the water has not stopped moving. Our lives have not stopped changing. And we still need a way to talk about what happens when the tide in us rises. So why do we keep coming back to water? That woman in the water. Because it was never only sailors and Victorian painters.
She is everywhere again now, slipping through our social media feeds and our fiction and our aesthetics with wet hair and sharp teeth and a song we all pretend we are not hearing. She is the sea witch on Instagram selling candles and spell kits and cord-cutting rituals. She is the mermaid aesthetic, iridescent eyeshadow, wet look hair, scales tattooed around her ankles, clamshell jewelry, wave tattoos, and captions about being too wild for this world. She is the moody lighthouse wallpaper on your phone, the shipwreck print on your wall, that playlist called Storm at Sea inside my head. The sea woman is rarely ordinary. She tends to surface when people are tired of being good, tired of being legible, tired of turning themselves into something clean and useful and easy to explain. She rises when the little boxes get too small, when the productivity charts start looking like cages, when the good girl script finally splits at the seams. There is a reason witches, and sea witches in particular, have become such powerful symbols in recent years. The witch has always been the woman at the edge of the village, the one who refuses to be useful in the approved way. She lives where the rules thin out. She keeps strange hours. She knows what grows in the ditch and what blooms only at night. She is feared because she is difficult to manage, and desired because some part of us wants to know what life would feel like if we stopped managing ourselves so carefully. The sea witch is that impulse with sea salt on it. She lives beyond the last cottage, past the last streetlight, where the land gives up and the tide takes over. She is what happens when you carry your wildness all the way to the shoreline and then refuse to stop there. And mermaids are being reclaimed too, not only as pretty creatures or as tragic warnings, but as figures of agency, ecological grief, sensuality, rebellion, and borderlessness. There is something incredibly tempting about a body that belongs to no nation, crosses no border checkpoint, answers to no office calendar, and cannot be made entirely useful on land. Of course we want her. We are living in a time when so many people are spectacularly burnt out. We are told to be endlessly productive, endlessly available, endlessly optimized, endlessly healing, endlessly branding ourselves into something palatable. We are asked to turn our jobs into identities, our wounds into content, our rest into a productivity hack, our spirituality into aesthetic, and our grief into a caption with decent engagement. We leaned in until something cracked. And when the girl boss myth finally begins to collapse under its own stupid little blazer, another fantasy surfaced. Not climbing higher. Not doing more. Not becoming the most efficient version of ourselves before breakfast. But disappearing. Walking into the sea. Letting your inbox rot where it stands. No wonder this idea shows up in memes and jokes and half-serious fantasies. It is the darkly comic underside of the mermaid aesthetic. It's not, I want to be beautiful and mystical, but instead, what if I simply slipped beneath the waves and become unavailable to capitalism? People want to disappear, because disappearing can sound a lot like freedom when you have spent too long being watched, measured, corrected, requested, needed, interpreted, and expected to respond in a timely manner. People want untamed spaces. People want enchantment back. People want to belong to something that does not immediately ask them to monetize that experience. And here is where the water itself matters again. We already know, even beyond myth, that water does something to us. We just discussed that research around blue spaces and their known effect on our bodies. It works because all of it gives our attention somewhere to go that is larger than our own worry. So when you find yourself staring at a video of waves longer than you meant to, or fantasizing about a cottage by the sea where no one knows your email address, remember everything we've discussed here. That feeling is your body recognizing something regulating and reaching for it. Then we layer myth on top of the nervous system. Water is already calming us, and then it becomes a symbol of the unconscious, of emotion, of change, of escape, of transformation. When life feels over-controlled, when every other hour is scheduled and every feeling is evaluated and every part of you is at risk of becoming content, of course we long for an element that refuses all of that. Of course we reach for stories where someone actually does it. Maybe we do not want to be the woman walking into the sea, but we want to know that somewhere in some story, walking into the water is still an option. And this is where the sea woman and Ophelia begin to overlap. Because so many of these water-bound figures live at the edge between fascination and danger. We are drawn to them because they embody longing and grief and freedom and transformation and all of the unruly emotions that refuse to stay neatly contained. But we are also drawn to them because they are visible. They are watched. Their suffering is often part of the story. And we live in a culture that is very confused about vulnerability. We know, or at least many of us are trying to learn, that honest vulnerability can be brave. Researcher and storyteller Brené Brown built an entire body of work around the idea that vulnerability is not weakness, but courage. The willingness to be seen when there are no guarantees about how people will respond. Telling the truth about pain can be holy work. Letting other people see us clearly without the armor, without the perfect little performance of being fine, can be a part of how we survive. But one of the things Brown is careful to point out is that vulnerability is not the same thing as indiscriminate exposure. Vulnerability requires trust, discernment, and most of all, boundaries. It is not spilling every wound into every room. It is not handing strangers the keys to your inner life and calling that authenticity. Vulnerability creates connection because it's rooted in relationship. It is an act of courage, not an act of emotional exhibitionism. And that distinction matters because we also live inside platforms that know how to turn anything into a spectacle. So our pain becomes content. Collapse becomes aesthetic. That public unraveling gets styled, captioned, filtered, and held up as proof of authenticity. In spiritual spaces especially, this is so slippery. The boundaryless meltdown is being sold as freedom. Recklessness gets dressed up as liberation. The refusal to be accountable gets rebranded as being too wild, too raw, too ratchety, too untamed for ordinary people to understand. What looks like vulnerability is not always vulnerability. Sometimes it is armor in disguise. Sometimes oversharing functions as a way to control the narrative, demand intimacy that has not been earned, or to keep people focused on the performance of pain rather than the work of healing. And paradoxically, it often creates the opposite of connection. So instead of drawing people closer, it can generate distrust, discomfort, or emotional distance. Real vulnerability invites relationship. Boundaryless disclosure invites spectators. And there she is again, Ophelia. Not always floating in the river this time, but arranged beautifully enough that we are invited to stare. So this is a part I want to be careful with, because real suffering is real suffering. I'm not interested in mocking pain or demanding that everyone grieve privately in some tasteful little corner where no one has to be inconvenienced. But there is a difference between being witnessed and being consumed. There is a difference between telling the truth about your wounds and building a throne out of them. There is a difference between refusing shame and making your chaos everyone else's weather system. When suffering becomes the brand, survival can start to feel like bad marketing, and that is dangerous. Because it teaches us all over again that the beautiful breakdown is more compelling than the quiet repair. That the spiral deserves the spotlight, while the boundary, the apology, the accountability, the medication, the therapy appointment, the rest, the hard conversations, the unglamorous act of not lighting the match this time, that all of that is somehow less poetic. Healing has poetry in it too. Survival has poetry in it. The woman who climbs out of the water, wrings out her dress, and refuses to drown for anyone's aesthetic has poetry in her too. And maybe that is part of why we keep returning to mermaids, sirens, selkies, sea witches, and river mothers, and all of the strange women at the water's edge. They let us rehearse the fantasy of losing control without actually destroying our lives. They let us imagine becoming less controlled, less legible, less domesticated, while still leaving us a path back to ourselves. A life where you answer to tides instead of timesheets, where your moods make weather, where your too muchness becomes a source of power, not a thing to be trimmed down for other people's comfort. Maybe, if we listen carefully, the point is not to literally grow a tail and vanish beneath the pier, tempting as that may be on certain days. But maybe the point is to let these stories remind us that wildness is not a defect, that longing for mystery and rest is not a character flaw, that needing spaces where we are not constantly performing is not weakness, but is a very old human hunger. The sea woman is rarely ordinary, but the desire she represents is. It lives in anyone who has ever wanted to drop the script, to step out of the role, to walk away from the version of themselves that everyone else finds convenient, and discover who might be waiting underneath. It lives in anyone who has ever wanted to belong to themselves again. And maybe that is why, at the end of all of this, I keep coming back to the image we started with. A small canoe on black water, cypress trees leaning close, something unseen moving just beneath the surface. Maybe we do not need to explain her away. Maybe we do not need to prove she exists. Maybe it is enough to sit by the water, feel that presence, and remember that there will always be parts of us and parts of this world that refuse to behave. Wow. Okay, so that got significantly deeper than I originally intended when I sat down to write what I thought was going to be a fun little episode about mermaids and sirens and spooky water ladies. But of course it did. Of course we started with a canoe on the Pocomoke River and somehow ended up in the symbolic architecture of grief, autonomy, colonial memory, sacred water, nervous system regulation, performative vulnerability, and women who refuse to behave. Because apparently I can't just say, oh, pretty mermaid, and then go about my business like a normal person. No, we had to go all the way down. But I am honestly so glad that we did. These stories deserve so much more than being flattened into glitter and fishtails and sexy danger. They deserve to be handled as old, strange, and layered things. These are stories about water, yeah, but they are also stories about power, about who gets to speak, who gets to leave, and who gets remembered beautifully, who gets turned into a warning, who gets worshipped, who gets erased, and who gets to belong to themselves. And that is clearly why I love them so much. You know, underneath all of these songs and scales and storm clouds, these stories keep asking us the same questions. What part of you still belongs to the water? What part of you refuses to be named neatly? What part of you is still waiting somewhere below the surface, listening for the tide? I'm so grateful you came along for this journey. This episode is also a companion piece to our June Just Add Magic subscription box, which is very much swimming in these haunted, salt-soaked sea witch waters. If you're part of the box this month, I hope this gives you a deeper little doorway into the theme. And if you're not, I still hope it leaves you with something lovely and strange to carry. You can find Blackwater Apothecary online, where we have our shop, our classes, our podcast, and our Patreon. I'll include links in the show notes along with resources, references, citations, and some starting points for the books, traditions, artists, scholars, and research that I touched on in this episode. And as always, I encourage you to follow those threads beyond me, especially when we touch on traditions and histories that are not mine to hold at the center. Let this episode be a doorway, not the whole ocean. Thank you for listening. Thank you for wandering with me. And if you find yourself beside dark waters sometime soon, whether it is a river, a bay, the ocean, or a puddle in the middle of a parking lot after a thunderstorm, maybe linger there for just a moment. Not because you need to prove anything is watching, but because some things do not need to be proven to be felt. The tide keeps coming in. The water keeps its own counsel. And somewhere just beneath the surface, something wild and old and beautifully unwilling to behave is still listening.